Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I was standing in the motorpool bay when the last television feed went to a fixed emergency banner and the audio froze. A red crawl repeated the same sentence, then cut to a national alert tone. I felt the vibration of the compressor through my boots and the sting of welding smoke that never quite left the rafters. The four of us, former soldiers kept on for end-of-unit inventory, watched the generator-powered screen go dark. No anchors, no studio lights, no ordinary noise to hide behind. Just the empty echo of a big concrete room and the realization that our last normal task, counting tools, logging serial numbers that no longer mattered, had ended without anyone telling us to stop. My name is Aaron Briggs. I left the army as a first lieutenant when our infantry battalion was deactivated. The armory we were closing down sat on the outer edge of a small town along a two-lane state highway. To the west were open fields and a bend of slow river. To the east were woods that climbed toward a long ridge. Out front, a little sign still said Eagle Rock Armory. It was old paint and it fit a place built when people believed that a wall, a flagpole, and a motorpool full of trucks could outlast chaos. When the outbreak finally pushed from rumour into street-level panic, we were the only four with keys. Sarah Knox, our crew chief from the old helicopter company, set her welding mask on top of a crate and glanced at the silent television. She was still in stained coveralls, hair tied back, gloves tucked through her belt. Marcus Flynn, my best marksman, breathed out through his nose and ran the bolt on a long rifle with the same careful rhythm he used to check a door latch. Evan Rhodes, young, fast, capable, stood with a clipboard he forgot to drop, his eyes moving between us for direction. We did not argue about whether to stay. Staying was the only choice that made sense. The armory's primary weapons racks had been cleared months earlier when the unit shut down, but everything else was still there. The plate steel we used to fabricate brackets for vehicle armor training, spools of welding wire, torches, chain hoists, forklift batteries, a diesel generator in its own shed, spare fuel, pallets of bottled water for drills, a small obstacle course, a supply shed with food for weekend training, racks of field gear, and enough tools to take apart and rebuild almost anything on wheels. The facility had a concrete block armory building with thick walls, a motorpool yard with heavy gates, and a roof strong enough for sandbags. It was not perfect, but it was better than a house with a wooden door or a storefront with glass. I told Marcus to lock the outer gate and chain the second barrier. I asked Evan to shut down non-essential circuits and bring up the generator at idle so we could disconnect and reroute power safely. Sarah powered the welding set, clicked her visor down, and handed me a grease-penciled list. "If we move fast," she said, "we can plate the office windows before it gets dark. If it goes loud out there, we need metal between us and glass." I did not answer. We were already moving. By the time the sun dropped, the main office windows had steel plates bolted into angle iron frames. Sarah guided the forklift like a surgeon, tucking scrap plate into the forks so we could hold pieces level while we tacked them in place and drilled through concrete block. We cut overlapping plates and left narrow slots for observation that could be closed with sliding covers. The front entry got a welded frame that accepted a swinging plate door. Sarah welded a thick steel bar into a hinge that locked into a slot we cut into the slab. When the plate swung shut and the bar dropped, the sound was a promise. We cleared the roof and hauled sandbags up the external ladder in a chain, 2 up, 2 down, masking the climb with canvas slings and a rhythm we could sustain. Marcus laid out lanes of fire, not to talk tough, but to make sense of angles. He chalked sectors on the roof's parapet and explained them to Evan like a coach drawing plays. We placed 2 tripods for optics and 2 observation chairs. Marcus built little baffles with leftover plate and sandbags, so that if we had to fire, we could do it from shadow and reduce the flash that the night would announce better than any shout. When we finished, I looked at my watch and translated the number in my head. It was 1900 hours, 7 in the evening, when the first vehicle honked at our gate. It was not a challenge honk. It was the sound people make when they hope someone decent is listening. I walked to the gate with a light held low and spoke before I was close enough to startle anyone. A woman answered from behind the hood of a dirty sedan. Her voice was controlled and tired. She explained that she had 2 kids in the car and an older neighbour in the back seat. She said they saw the sign for the armory and drove here because the town looked tense and the grocery store was closed early. She said the radio stations were repeating the same emergency message and then cut out. I asked their names and what they were carrying. I told them to keep hands visible and to please be patient because I would need to bring them in through the side gate, not the main gate, and that I could not guarantee we would keep them. I did not say that last part to be cruel. I said it because if we were going to protect this place, we could not let our good intentions write checks that food and water could not cash. Sarah and Marcus watched from the roof, while Evan and I opened the service gate on the riverside. We used the vehicle barrier Sarah had welded from a spare frame and hung a heavy chain with a quick release on the inside. The family pulled in. We parked their car between the motor pool and the supply shed, where we could see it and control it. We checked bags respectfully, asked a few more direct questions, and then walked them into the main building. The mother's name was Nadia. Her daughter, Lily, was old enough to track everything and save questions for later. The older neighbour's name was Henry. He needed water and a place to sit. We did not make them sleep in the car. There are rules in a bad world you can follow without losing your advantage. There are also choices you can make that decide who you are when the world is not simple. By midnight, 2400 hours, we had 3 more cars inside the fence. We had a mechanic's apprentice named Tyler who showed us steel-toed boots through the door before his face. We had a grocery manager named Marina who said she could organise a pantry with her eyes closed. We had an electrician named Daniel who asked about the generator with the curiosity of someone already solving problems in his head. We had enough people to justify the thing we were already doing. We had started turning an empty armory into a place that could carry more than its own weight. The next morning, we laid out the plan as if we were back in a platoon briefing, and for the first time since the television died, I saw what people needed. They needed tasks that made sense, clear lines between inside and outside, a method for decision-making, and a way to believe in the next hour. We wrote the day's goals on a whiteboard. We kept it plain. We would plate the remaining windows. We would harden the roof. We would strip usable armor pieces from training hulks and junked vehicles and weld them into panels along the inside of the fence, where chain link would not be enough. We would bring the generator inside its sound reduction enclosure and run the exhaust through a baffled pipe to reduce signature. We would inventory the fuel and treat diesel with stabilizer and biocide because stale fuel kills more plans than bad luck. We would wire a transfer switch for generator and solar because relying on one power source is a good way to be surprised. We would begin a rainwater capture system by adding gutters and downspouts to the long eaves of the motor pool and connecting them to food-grade barrels with first flush diverters. We would confirm water from the river could be filtered and boiled safely. We would set up a basic amateur radio station with a wire antenna and a ground rod, and we would bring the old police scanner online to monitor local emergency channels. We would establish watch shifts, sanitation rules, and a standing rule: no one opens a gate alone. It was work that felt like breathing. Sarah pulled armor plates from a training truck and clamped them to the fence, welding in horizontal bands to create a low wall that could stop anything shambling low and slow. Tyler cut L's and brackets and called distances out to Sarah without being asked. Marcus rigged a pair of ladders into a small tower at the rear corner where the fence ran close to the woodline. He braced it with diagonal supports and then dragged sandbags to its base until it stopped moving under his weight. Evan installed motion alarms that were just fishing bells on line, tied to empty cans set on crossbeams. We tried a battery-powered motion detector and discovered it triggered on every field mouse and gust of wind. The bells were better. When something bigger touched the wire, The rattle was a language we understood. We kept the generator at idle while Daniel and I traced the armory's circuits. The big diesel unit sat inside a cinder block shed with a steel door and vents. It had been installed for emergencies, not for continuous use. We unplugged what we did not need, labelled what we kept, and wired a sub-panel to supply the motor pool shop lights and the communications room we claimed from an empty office. We ran the exhaust through a pipe with a makeshift baffle that Sarah fabricated from nested tubes and perforated sleeves, then wrapped the line with mineral wool to cut the sound. We moved the set of forklift batteries out of the open bay, cleaned terminals, and connected them to an inverter charger we took from a training trailer so we could run lights and radios at night with the generator off. We dragged a pallet of solar panels from storage, training stock used for weekend demonstrations, and set them on the roof at a good angle, then ran cable into the battery room. The panels would not run everything, but they would carry the radio and the lights we actually needed. Marina walked the supply shed with a yellow pad and a calm sense of authority. She grouped canned goods by type and age, and added chalk marks for daily ration plans. She pulled a few boxes of meal, ready-to-eat rations, and counted them twice, then asked if we had preferences. She made a list of what people could cook without a full kitchen, and she asked for a little white paint to mark shelves. It was not about making things look nice. It was about making it easy for anyone to find what they needed, with a flashlight and a minute to spare. By late afternoon, 1600 hours, Marcus called down from the roof and told me to come up. I climbed with my rifle slung and a small set of binoculars. From the roof, you could see the highway where it passed the edge of town, and you could see the river's dull shine as it cut the fields. In the distance, we watched a trickle of vehicles that had not been there the day before. They moved with uncertainty, stopping at the single traffic light and then driving through it at odd intervals. The steady flow of ordinary life had thinned to disconnected dots. At one point, we watched a small sedan pull onto the shoulder and stop. The driver got out, looked around as if deciding between two unknowns, then got back in and turned down the wrong road. We had seen footage, of course, in the weeks before this. We had seen phone video of what everyone was calling the dead who move. We had watched medical officials answering questions while graveyards trended and then stopped trending. We had watched cities post health advisories about staying indoors. We had watched emergency crews respond at first with confidence and then with unconditional fatigue. Nothing on the screen matched the reality of a single figure walking in the field behind your fence line with a broken stride and the determination of a problem you cannot negotiate. When the first one came near at dusk, we did not test our courage with a shot. We tested our patience. We let him walk into our low wall. He pressed until the wire sang and the plates flexed. He clawed without urgency, and then he jammed a right hand into the mesh and lost balance. He did not talk. He did not shout. His head rested forward on the wire, as if he were listening for a doorbell. Marcus watched along the barrel of his rifle and spoke the way he always did when things mattered, even, plain, reminding us of steps we already knew. "No need to announce ourselves to the whole county," he said. "Let him hang until he stops moving. Noise discipline is not a superstition. Sound is a magnet in a crisis, and a magnet does not choose which iron filings to attract." We let him drag, and then slow, and then rest still. When the night was deeper and the field quiet, Marcus and I went out with a heavy pole and a loop we tightened, and we pulled him down. We used a tarp. We kept our gloves on. We did what we had to do with respect and efficiency. We brought the tarp back inside the gate and burned it in a drum along with 2 more tarps and the outer pair of our gloves. Sometimes you choose a detail because it makes you feel cleaner. Sometimes you choose it because you do not want your team to wonder what you forgot to clean. Over the next 2 days, more people came. We did not advertise. Word of a secure fence spreads the way water runs downhill. We were careful not to become a banner that lit the night. The generator only ran during the day and for short windows at night when we needed to weld or pump. We used battery lights. We covered windows so that a room could be bright inside without shouting in every direction that we had power to spare. By the end of the week, we had 21 inside the fence counting children. We converted the classroom in the main building into a sleeping area for families, using cots and stacked mats from storage. We set up a small clinic with the supplies we had, and we added a volunteer schedule where one of us stood watch. One of us handled incoming at the gate, and one of us roamed to fix what broke. We started a board where people wrote skills and what they could do without supervision. We learned that Henry had been a small-town paramedic 20 years earlier, and he still knew how to set a splint and check an airway better than any of us. We learned that Lily could learn a radio protocol faster than most adults and stick to it when she was nervous. And that mattered because we needed a call sign protocol people could trust under pressure. We made ours simple. No bravado, no complex codes, just who you are, where you are, and whether you're okay. Our first week also taught us what it meant to run a compound, where the fence was a line between safety and all the problems on the other side. The dead came to the wire because sound and motion pulled them like tides. Some stood with the patience of a clock that does not know its battery is running down. Some wandered off the way a kite pulls free when wind shifts. The living also came. Some asked to trade, some asked to stay. Some thought they could demand what we had, as if our fence were a suggestion. One afternoon, 2 men pulled up in a panel van with its back seats missing. They said they were former soldiers from a unit based 2 towns away, and they wanted fuel. They said they had people depending on them. I watched their hands and their eyes more than their words. Their rifles were clean and their sleeves were rolled high, showing skin where the sun had not had time to work. Their truck had dust on it that did not match the rain line. It felt like a uniform someone put on for effect. I told them that we were rationing fuel and that if they wanted to trade, we traded for seeds, tools, medicine, or information. They did not like that list. They told me it would be a good idea to fill their cans because their friends would come back to collect. I told them to please leave before we had to choose between their feelings and our safety. Marcus took a picture of the van and the plate with a long lens from the roof and did not hide that he was taking it. The men left, hands open in a gesture that always hides a plan. We braced. When trouble introduces itself with a promise to return, you do not wait at your door with a single lock. You build depth. We spent the next 48 hours building layers. We moved junk vehicles into a lane outside the main gate to create a channel we could control. We welded mesh and plate into a set of rolling obstacles that could pin a vehicle for a minute without ruining our own gate. We dug shallow trenches and piled dirt to make low berms that changed the angle of approach. We strung wire at knee height inside the channel so that anyone trying to sprint through would find their legs tangled rather than their hands full of our gate. We built 2 remote noisemakers with battery-powered drills and bent zip ties that tapped plastic bottles. The strange little machine that had made children laugh at fairs, now rewired to be a lure we could throw and abandon if we needed to move a small crowd without firing a shot. We staged fire extinguishers and buckets and an extra hose near the gate because anyone smart enough to come back angry would think about fire as a weapon. We walked civilians through the plan for a blackout, for a breach, and for the word none of us liked, but all of us had to know: retreat. Our long-term plan took shape as we stayed busy surviving our short-term plan. We could not live forever on canned food and handouts. We needed to grow food quickly. We built a small greenhouse frame out of conduit and plastic sheeting against the south wall of the motor pool and filled beds with soil pulled from the field and amended with what little we could find in sacks at the supply store. Marina handed out seed packets like loan documents. We rigged a simple drip line from a barrel and put a screen on the feed to keep it from clogging. Tyler welded brackets to hold barrels in a row so that we could capture roof water when it rained and let the first dirty water pass before we collected the clean variable that came after. We built a small compost area in the far corner and set clear rules for what could go there. We drew a line between waste that would attract pests and waste that would help us build something that fed the greenhouse. We enforced it because rules that concern the future seem abstract until a rat runs across the floor and changes minds. We also improved our communications. We set up the amateur radio in a small room with a grounded copper rod pounded through the slab into damp soil. We strung a long wire antenna in an L shape from the roof to a pole near the fence and added an insulator at the end. The radio could reach farther than the police scanner could hear. We listened to weather broadcasts first, because those were stable and carried a voice we could calibrate our expectations to. Then we swept the bands for other survivors. We heard a husband and wife on the edge of a lake talking in calm tones about fish traps. We heard a small cluster of voices in the hills speaking with practiced brevity about water and fuel, and the way the dead clustered below ridgelines at night. We heard a faint, repeating message from a group that claimed to be near a correctional facility 20 miles away. They said they were under new control and had food to trade for fuel. They sounded organized in a way that people sound when they have been forced to choose a leader who understands punishment. A day later, we learned more about that place the hard way. It came in fragments on the radio first, then in a choked voice from a man at our gate. He said his name was Miguel, and he held a handheld radio that matched the brand and model of the set we used for our internal communications. He looked like he had not slept in days, and he kept glancing at the fence the way an animal watches the tree line. We brought him in carefully and gave him water and a place to sit. He told us that a group had taken over the old prison complex after the state pulled staff and told remaining personnel to go home to their families. Some of the prisoners had walked out. Many stayed, confused, alone, or too injured to move. A former tactical supervisor from the correctional staff had gathered the strongest and the most desperate and turned them into a private force. They had fuel stolen from a county yard and a loudspeaker they used like a lever. He said they were running short on food, and he said they had sent him to listen near our fence, not to negotiate, but to learn how many we were and what we were scared of. He slid the handheld radio across the table and said, "You will want to hear this." The voice on the other end was plain and confident. It laid out a plan in pieces. Lure the dead toward our fence at night with noise. Push a small team through a weak point while we were busy. Take the generator first, and then the fuel. They think you will not risk fire, Miguel said. They are right to assume that. But they do not understand you can fight a fire if you prepare. And they do not understand you can move them where you want to move them. He looked at the cup in his hands. I left because a girl asked me not to be the man they wanted me to be, he said. And he did not explain more, and we did not press him. We had 7 days, he said. That was their plan. A full assault within a week after a series of small tests. We did not debate how to use the time. We made a list as long as an arm and started at the top. At dawn on the first day, we sent a team of 4 on a silent extraction mission to a farm we had scouted. It had a long metal barn and an old greenhouse with cracked panels. We knew from a distance that it still held a cache of seeds and basic tools because a calendar on the barn wall had a planting schedule circled in pen, and a wall chart listed varieties and weights taken in the last season. Marcus led. Evan drove a small truck that we had set up to run quiet with a baffled exhaust, and Daniel and I followed with hand trucks and rope. We cut the engine half a mile out and moved on foot along a hedgerow to reduce our profile. We used hand signals and simple directions. We kept our eyes on corners and the lines where the sky meets the roof. When we reached the barn, we found the double doors chained but not locked like a fortress. Inside, the smell of soil and oil and dried plant matter told us we had been right about value. We took the seed tins first, then the simple greenhouse tools, then the heavy sacks of soil amendment. We rolled half a dozen used barrels down the lane and levered them onto the truck bed with a simple ramp. We moved without panic, but without pauses. When a single figure appeared at the end of the lane, swaying and intent, Marcus raised his palm, and I watched him count in his head until the rhythm of its walk matched the distance we needed. We moved the hand trucks like we were carrying sleeping children and left without introducing ourselves to anyone we did not need to meet. The next day, we focused on the fence. We added angled standoff bars along the top row and wired on a second layer of mesh offset from the first, so fingers would not find easy grip on holes that lined up. We built 2 emergency exit ladders within the compound, in case we had to move quickly from one sector to another without using the courtyard. We rigged 2 ropes with knots and padded the top edge of the wall with scrap tire so that someone could slide over in a hurry without leaving skin behind. Tyler fabricated a pair of pivoting steel frames we could raise at a moment's notice to create a dead space immediately outside the gate. If a truck pushed through and was stopped, it would be stopped in a place we controlled from 3 angles. We mapped arcs of fire to overlap without risking our own people. We explained to civilians that they would not be shooting unless the last line was threatened, but that they would know how to load, clear, and make safe any firearm we put in their hands. We taught safety rules first. We did not teach bravado. The day after that, we spent in the radio room, and on the roof, we listened long enough to patterns to hear the gaps. At night, the dead drifted out of the lower woods to gather at the highway, where sounds echoed under an overpass. In the hour before dawn, the noise across the river died completely for almost 20 minutes. We noted that when thunderheads rolled from the west, the first gusts struck leaves on the east side of the trees and stripped enough debris that a rain curtain formed near the gate. We saw where our field of view was weak in the far corner near a service ditch. We placed a passive infrared sensor facing the ditch and wired it to a silent lamp on the roof that only we could see. We did not depend on it. We added it to the bag of small advantages we were collecting. On the 4th day, we sent a patrol to find a supply convoy that had left a small neighborhood farther up the river 2 days earlier and had not returned. We followed tire marks along a dirt lane and then found the empty frame of a trailer in the ditch. We saw where someone had pulled the hitch pin in a hurry and where boxes had been dragged through grass. We found footprints not weighty enough to be a group of heavy men and not scattered enough to be a mass. It looked like a small team. Moving goods they understood, with discipline. We marked the find on our map and left a small sign in our code for the convoy to see if they came back. On the way home, we found 2 dead shambling along the ditch and let them pass, then turned our minds back to what we could control, people who would try to reach into our compound and take what we needed to live. On the 5th day, we built booby traps that were not tricks but tools. We wired tin cans and glass shards into bags of gravel, set on small trip lines in lanes outside the fence where a team might try to sneak. If they came at night and took 1 step wrong, we would hear the scrape. We assembled 2 devices that firefighters on the team recognized: small water sprayers with a backpack tank and hand pump, a thing meant to fight brush fires before they spread. We staged them with 2 full barrels of water near the spots we had identified as likely to be set alight. We also stretched hose to both corners. Daniel built a simple manifold from a T-fitting so we could deploy 2 lines from a single spigot, and we added shut-off valves so we would not need to stand and hold pressure constantly. We put leather gloves and goggles next to each hose because smoke cuts plan to shreds if you cannot see. On the 6th day, we sat at the long table and rehearsed decisions we might need to make quickly. If they demanded a hostage swap, what would we say? If they threw a small propane cylinder through the gate, what would we do? If they tried to saw through the hinge pins on the service gate, how would we slow them down? We solved some things with metal and some things with words. We wrote a script for the first 30 seconds of a shouted exchange at the gate, because those 30 seconds decide whether you are in charge of your own story. We made it clear we would trade food for fuel and water for information, and that we had nothing of theirs to return. We also made it clear that if they entered our gate with weapons in hand, we would treat that as the beginning and the end of a negotiation. We were not playing at a world where a call to 911 would send a car with lights to our address. On the 7th night, they came. It began with the sound of a speaker truck somewhere just beyond the bend in the river. The music was loud and brash and chosen to punch through trees and into the empty holes in people's nerves. Then the truck cut its engine and let the speakers run on battery. The rhythm became a heartbeat where no one needed a heartbeat. Minutes later, we heard the bells on our line rattle near the back corner. Not the anxious ping of a small animal, the rattle of a weight that thought it could test wire instead of respecting it. The light on the roof glowed. Our private signal that the infrared had seen something move through the ditch and then went dark again. Marcus took the west sector on the roof, with Lily at the radio next to him. She had a headset and a small notebook, and she breathed through her mouth as if that would make time quieter. Evan moved to the main gate with two of our civilians, who had practiced how to work the hose and the sprayer. Sarah stood near the generator with a wrench and a spare belt, because if they got a hand on our fuel and our power, everything else became a lesson in unacceptable risk. I was at the service gate where the fence met the wood line. It was the most likely breach point because it was narrow and older, and because smart people choose places where your attention is already pointed somewhere else. The dead came first to the front. They pressed against the mesh near the speaker's echo, and they moaned the way people do when they have forgotten how to use words for pain, but still feel a pull toward the source of it. We let the noisemakers we had built lead a small clump away to the east. Evan tossed one near the far corner and turned it on. The click and buzz drew a little group and bought us half a minute at a time, when a man appeared at the outer lane we had built with junk cars and began shouting that he had authority from the prison to negotiate. I did not step forward to make him feel big. I let him talk to the closed gate. I let him see that our gate was a wall and that nobody inside was interested in starting a conversation in the dark. He banged the gate with his hand and shouted that we would be sorry. He raised a radio and spoke 2 words in a tone that meant he was not talking to us. Then he stepped back, and the lane behind him filled with 3 figures who moved with intention, not with hunger. I saw the spark near the hinge first. A lit rag fell against the base of the gate where spilled fuel would turn heat into change. Evan shouted for water, and Marina was already there with a hose and a sprayer. The stream knocked the small flame flat, and the spray soaked the wood they had stacked near the hinge. Someone threw a glass bottle that broke against the mesh and flared for a second like a trick candle. Someone else tried to climb the mesh and found the offset layers, and the angled standoffs did not love their fingers. 2 of our civilians got eyes full of smoke and fell back coughing. Henry was there with eyewash and a hand on shoulders, moving people away from the edge so they could breathe again and come back at a different angle. The attack at the main gate stalled without the satisfaction of a line broken and men flowing through. That was the plan. Not to win with force, but to break a rhythm until someone with a clock in his head realized all his arrows had been fired and the target still stood. The second try came where I was waiting. 2 shadows moved in the ditch, fast and low. If I'd been alone, I would have missed the third. Marcus saw the cross angle from the roof and tapped his mic twice. That was our prearranged way to say "look left" without shouting. I looked left and saw the small form of a crouched runner who was waiting for his 2 friends to pull our attention. They moved on my wire, and the cans hissed a small slide of glass. I let them cut 2 of the lines we had wired across the gap, because if they cut one, and our response was always instant, the third would be ready for our motion. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On 6, I hit the floodlight position to blind the ditch, and Marcus cracked around into the earth a foot in front of the third man's toes. The strike of dirt and the sudden light changed 3 minds at once. 2 fell flat, hands to their eyes. The third, who had been the brave one a second earlier, crawled backward like a man who has just remembered how to be 9 years old. We did not shoot them. They were not inside our fence. They had not committed a harm we could not reverse. We shouted that the next time the light came on, they would see the world clearly, and they should choose to be far away from where they were standing. Someone out front started the speaker truck again. The music pounded and then, without warning, cut to a recorded voice. It was a girl's voice, young and tired, asking for help. It was a recording made to reach into people and pull. I sent Lily to the far room, so she would not have to hear the sound of someone her age used like a flag. The recording played twice, and then the battery sagged, and the speakers drew breath like lungs at the end of a sprint. The voice thinned. The sound slowed. The night went quiet except for the bell on the far wire, which rang once more as if a single person had thought better of testing fate. The attack ebbed. We did not chase. That was the point of building a home and not a trap. I told the team to drink water and check their pulses. Henry checked smoke in the back of the throats and handed out a few tablets he said would make the next morning less sharp. We stood down from the places where you get tunnel vision. We walked the inside of the fence and found where someone had probed and where we had guessed wrong about what someone would try. We added 2 more small fixes that would make the next version of the same story harder to tell. Then we went to the radio room and listened. That was how we heard the plan for their full assault. They were not careful enough because they did not think anyone would be listening while they spoke in a place where their own walls reflected their confidence back at them. The former corrections supervisor set a time, 2 nights from now, just after midnight, and told his team they would approach from both the river bend and the junk lane. He said they would set fires in both corners to force us to divide, then push a small team through the service gate because he thought we would open it to clear smoke. He said they would take our generator first because he understood what power does for a place like ours. He said they would use the dead like cattle, herding them with noise. He was not a fool. He had learned to manage men with needs instead of principles. That works until the day it meets a wall built with something stronger than fear. We adjusted, we prepared, we borrowed a trick from storm responders and built a small negative pressure box to keep smoke out of the main building using a fan and filters that we sealed into a window with tape and weather stripping. We added a set of hanging fire blankets on sliding rails inside the main corridor that could stop a hot draft from turning a hallway into a chimney. We cut 2 small holes in the roof and fitted them with caps we could open by a rope from below, so that if smoke did get in, it would have a place to go that was not the lungs of kids sleeping on cots. We moved the generator fuel to 2 separate locations and left decoy cans full of dyed water near the obvious spot, because if they did get in, we wanted them to grab what looked like value and leave with nothing we could not replace. When the night came, it arrived with a stillness that made sound travel. I stood at the service gate with Sarah and Tyler and felt the slight change in air that a river gives off when it moves under a thin moon. We heard a single clink far down the lane. Then we heard footsteps, deliberate, light, spaced. We heard the voice from the recording again, now played softly, meant to make a sentry lean forward to hear and step toward the sound that would pull him out of cover. We did not step. We used the rope we had rigged to move the baffle in front of the gate, blocking the view of anyone crouched with bolt cutters, and we flipped the cap on the small fresh air vent we had added, so we would not be breathing old air while we waited. At the front, Evan radioed that the first fire had been set. He did not sound anxious. He sounded like a man reading a gauge. Fire in the southeast corner, small, fueled by cloth and a splash of gasoline, no wind worth naming. Marina opened the valve and a stream of water flattened the flame. Henry pulled one of the backpack sprayers to the base of the burning materials and pumped a fine mist until smoke lay down. On the roof, Marcus counted figures with his optics and called out positions with plain language. 2 crouched behind the second junk car, 3 moving along the ditch, 1 watching from the rear. We kept our own noise low. When they realized the first fire had not grown, they started a second near the service gate. That was where we were waiting. The person who threw the bottle had a good arm and bad timing. The bottle broke on the mesh outside, not inside. The flame ran across the plate and sputtered. Sarah opened the small clean air vent to give us a safe place to breathe if smoke rolled. Then she closed it because she did not have to prove to anyone that she was ready. A figure ran to the hinge with a saw. He squeezed the trigger once, and the blade skated on the pin with a sound that carried. Before he could settle in, Marcus put a round into the concrete just above his head. The spall showered his neck and made him flinch hard enough to fall backward into the ditch. The message was not that we were better shots. The message was that we were awake. The push at the front tried to come again. We had left the speaker truck alone earlier because hitting it would have been a declaration and because noise attracts noise. Now, with the attack in motion and our people at the hoses, Marcus took the shot we had rehearsed. He put a round into the speaker cone from the roof at a slight angle so the bullet would punch through metal. not ricochet into the field. The music died, and the sudden absence of it took courage away, with the same efficiency it had earlier used to build it. A man at the lane shouted that we were thieves, that everything in the armory was public property, that we had stolen what should be shared. The argument died under its own weight, because he sounded like someone who believed rules still worked when he needed them, and did not when he did not. I shouted back that if they wanted to talk trade at sunrise, with weapons down and hands visible, we would listen, and that if they came inside our gate with tools and flames, they would leave their tools on the ground, and their flames in the rain we would make with hoses. The fight did not become a battle. It became a slow failure to take our night from us. After 40 minutes of trying, they pulled back. The dead had followed the noise to the edges and pressed against the fence in predictable places. We let them gather, and then we used the remote noisemaker to move them to a harmless section where they reached for wire that did not open. It was not heroic. It was chores that looked like defense because we had decided they would be. At dawn, we sent a note back with Miguel. He had watched the attack from the far field, not with their team and not with ours. And when he returned to the gate, he looked like a man whose body had no more room for anger. We wrote a plain message. It said that we would trade food for seed and tools, water for information, and minor medical help for work. It said that we would not supply fuel for raids, and that any attempt to use the dead as a weapon would be treated the way a community treats a brush fire, contained, cooled, and reported to neighbours who do not want to watch their own field light up. It said that if their leader wanted to talk about moving his people to the old fairgrounds, where there were still intact barns and enough land to plant, we would help plan, and we would offer radio coordination with other small groups who had soil and a need for hands. It also said that if he came with a weapon on his shoulder and demand in his voice, the gate would remain a wall and his people would stay hungry. 2 days later, a single radio courier came to our lane with a white cloth tied to a stick. He handed the cloth to Evan and said the leader of the prison group had declined our offer and promised to return with numbers. "He does not believe you will shoot at dawn," the courier said. "He believes you are better people than he is." He said it without cynicism. He said it like a man comparing maps. We took his picture and we gave him a bottle of water, and we watched him walk back down the road with a little tilt in his head that said he was squinting toward a horizon that did not reward squinting. That night our radios were quiet. We did not sit and wait. We went back to work because work is how you run a place that deserves its name. We expanded the greenhouse by 2 beds and set up a seed bank in a metal cabinet with tins labelled and dated. We taught adults how to check each other's gear and not be embarrassed by that shared competence. We set a morning schedule that looked like a school day because children need structure for reasons that are not sentimental. We began training a small civilian militia for perimeter duty. Marcus focused on safety, communication, and discipline more than on speed or bravado. He taught them how to breathe. He taught them how to hold a rifle without acting like they were applying for a position in a movie. He showed them how to work a bolt slowly and how to wait a second longer than their nerves wanted. He made them wait in comfortable silence until a breeze lifted and lowered the grass. Then he told them to close the bolt like they meant it and to see the result without shouting their victory into the field. In the radio room, Lily discovered her gift for nets. She listened for the patient voices in a sea of panic and learned their rhythms. She kept a log without gaps and wrote times out in words the way I had taught her, so that if someone needed to reconstruct a day, they could do it even if the digits on a clock were smeared by a greasy thumb. She located 2 other groups who had built safe zones, one at a lakeside campground with sturdy stone shelters, another at a repair shop with a fenced yard, and an old diesel tank they had cleaned and filled halfway. She mapped addresses with distances to fuel them. When storms came through, she relayed weather warning from the national broadcast with a professionalism that made the older men in the room straighten their posture. At the end of each shift, she took off the headset and breathed deep, and then asked if she could help with anything else. Children grow into jobs if you let them, and sometimes a job helps a child become someone who can look at a hard thing without losing focus. A week after the second attack, Miguel returned with a girl in tow. She was the voice on the recording. He said her name was Raina and that she had asked to leave when she realized she had become a tool. He said they had posted a notice on the prison gate that anyone who wanted to build something real could come to the fairgrounds at noon the next day, and that he would be there with a radio and a paper with roles to fill. Water team, digging team, fence crew, cook team, night watch. He said he did not know if the leader would allow it. He said he would go anyway, and that if we wanted to send someone to watch, we could. We did not have to debate. We would send two with radios and a simple instruction: observe, do not engage, be ready to help if the situation turned into something we were willing to own. Marcus and I walked a quarter mile from the fairgrounds, parked in a shallow cut, and watched with binoculars. At noon, 3 people came, then 10, then 30. They arrived in small clusters that had formed around skill more than around friendship. A man with a shovel on his shoulder greeted people with a nod and pointed them toward what he imagined would be a well's edge. A woman with a clipboard, Marina would have liked her, sorted people into lines that made sense. A small argument broke out and ended when someone with quiet authority said that the argument could be had after the first post was in the ground. The prison leader came at last in a truck that growled like a dog at a fence it could not see through. He stood on the tailgate and shouted about loyalty and how this was a time for strength. He said those who had come to the fairgrounds were not strong. He said they were abandoning the group. He did not bring the men he had sent against our gate. He did not bring the young or the old. He brought 3 men who carried themselves like assistants. When he realized that the people in front of him were not going to stop and listen, he tried to throw down a line that would always work inside walls. He said he would control access to food. The sentence fell into an air that did not hold it. It did not belong there, because he did not hold the place any longer where food came from. He held a prison, not a field. We did not move forward. It was not our rally. Miguel stood up on a hay bale and lifted his hands the way a conductor quiets a room. He spoke in full sentences, and he did not shout. He said that anyone who wanted to work would have a job, and anyone who wanted to keep a piece of power could go back to a building that was not going to feed a single person in the winter. He said fuel without seed was a road to nowhere. He said shouting at a gate would not make grain. He said the group at the armory had shown that a fence could be more than a threat. It could be a promise to protect what you plant. He said he was not in charge, but he would carry in his pocket the list of what needed to be done, and he would share that list with anyone who wanted to take a line and make it their own. The prison leader looked around the field like a man who had expected his script to carry him. He saw faces turned away and backs bent to work, and he understood. He left without trying to prove something he could not build. At the edge of the field, he saw me and Marcus in the ditch, and he knew he had been watched by people who knew the difference between a loud command and a plan. He did not wave. Over the next weeks, we became what we had wanted to become the first night we closed the gate, a place that traded stability for effort. We built a basic training plan for civilians who wanted to help at the fence, something that taught not only how to hold a rifle and how to aim, but how to stand on a roof at 2 a.m. and know whether an odd noise mattered. We taught how to point with words instead of flailing arms. We taught how to step back from the wire when breath fogged the glasses people wore to protect their eyes from sparks. We taught the small things that keep a place like ours from eating itself. How to put a tool back in the same place every time. How to refill a can the minute it empties. How to write on a whiteboard the thing you took so no one else spends an hour looking for it. It made some people roll their eyes at first. It made those same people a little proud when they saw the result. Our seed bank grew. The greenhouse turned from a hopeful structure into a room with humidity on the plastic and rows of green that did not care about plans written on a whiteboard. We built raised beds outside with hardware cloth underneath to keep rodents from tunneling up. We installed a simple fence around the beds and strung lines with scraps of ribbon that moved in the wind, a trick that saved enough seedlings to matter. We set a rule that the first harvest would feed the seed bank before it fed anyone else. Then we set the second rule that no one could ever accuse us of hoarding. We wrote out the reasons and posted them for everyone to read. When rules are written and explained, they carry farther. We built a small water testing bench in the shop with pH paper, a simple turbidity tube, and a few reagents Daniel remembered from a class he took years earlier. It was not a laboratory, but it let us know if the river water was loaded with sediment or if it carried obvious contaminants after a storm. We added a second filter stage to our setup, ceramic followed by activated carbon. Then we boiled for cooking and drinking. We taught everyone to close the lids on barrels with the same attention to detail we used to check a weapons chamber. Water is indifferent to pride. It molds or it feeds, and it will not forgive the person who sets it aside without respect. We linked on the radio with the Lakeside group and then with a repair shop that had turned itself into a depot. We built a schedule where each group checked in at the top of the hour, 4 times a day. We created a shared ledger for fuel and food stores. We started sending small scavenger teams with lists written by other people instead of lists written by us. We taught our people how to show respect when they arrived somewhere with a fence. Never park at the gate. Never honk. Never shout. Announce on the radio if one is available. Approach on foot with empty hands at shoulder height. Ask permission to step closer. It sounds like ritual until you remember that ritual is just a shared set of actions that keeps people alive. We also found something like governance. It was not a council with gavel and agenda. It was a whiteboard with 3 names and the willingness to step aside when someone else needed to lead. Every morning at 9:00 hours, we held a short meeting in the shop where anyone could speak for 2 minutes. No one could speak a second time until everyone who wanted to had had a first turn. I led most mornings at the beginning. 2 months later, I led 1 morning out of 3, and that was the right number. A place built by former soldiers will get brittle if former soldiers never let go of the handle. You have to let a grocery manager set ration rules, and you have to let a teenager run a radio net, and you have to let a mechanic apprentice say no when someone wants to borrow a tool he knows how to use and they do not. The prison group did not disappear. They shrank. The men who cared about noise and control more than work drifted toward places that would welcome them. A few came to our gate without swagger. We asked them to leave their old stories outside and take jobs that meant they would share sweat before they shared opinions. A handful stayed and did exactly that. A handful left when they realized they could not explain their way into a place at the table. The former corrections supervisor drove by once at dusk, slowed, and then moved on. I do not know where he went. I know he did not come again, and that absence is a good end to a chapter like his. Late in the fall, we stood on the roof and watched clouds build over the ridge. The river ran higher, the days shortened, the greenhouse light changed. We had 3 months of experience and more scars on our plans than on our people. We had 4 small trading partners connected by a radio schedule. We had a seed bank with tins labelled by careful hands. We had barrels full and set on level blocks. We had a little library of printed instructions for the things people would need to do in the dark with gloves on. We had a community that could carry a day without me, and that meant our original goal, the one that only existed as an instinct the night Sarah dropped the steel bar into the hinge, had been met. That night, we held a small ceremony that was not about a banner or a speech. We wrote 5 words on the whiteboard: eat together, then stand watch. We served a meal from the greenhouse and the pantry and the last of the summer's trade. We ate in the motor pool with tools set aside and welders cold. After, people stood and washed dishes without being asked, and somebody swept. Lily checked the radio quietly and then turned it off. The kids will walk to their cots, and the adults took their places without complaint, because the kind of security we had built is not a thing someone else hands you. It is a task you claim. At 2200 hours, 10 in the evening, I took the west roof with Marcus. The air smelled like wet leaves and diesel that had long ago been wiped from a hand onto a railing. Down in the field, a figure moved along the fence, impatient and slow at the same time, like a thought that will not leave. It pressed and pulled, and then it stayed. We watched it. We did not fire. The metal of our low wall sang its quiet note and then fell silent. When I looked over at Marcus, he was watching the greenhouse instead. "The light holds," he said. Below us, Sarah walked the line with Tyler, pointing with a flashlight held at her knee, showing him where a bolt needed to be tightened and where a weld would crack in the cold if he did not grind it clean first. At the far corner, Evan stood with a thermal viewer he had traded for a case of tinned peaches 2 towns over, learning to distinguish a deer from a problem. On the bench inside the radio room, Lily had left a note for the night shift. "Check in at 0200 hours with the lake and the shop. Ask about the storm. Make sure the fairgrounds have cover for their woodpile." In the morning, we would add more brackets to a gate, and we would plant winter greens in a cold frame, and we would fix a hinge that squeaked. We would train more people to use a fire hose without letting the pressure yank their arms. We would mark a new rule on the board and erase an old one that did not apply. We would answer the radio and coordinate a small convoy with a sensible plan. We would add 2 inches of gravel near the greenhouse door so mud would not collect. We would watch the river and take notes. We would keep the children busy in the hour before supper when trouble likes to grow. We would refuse the temptation to announce a victory we had not yet earned. I stood by the parapet and listened to the quiet the way I used to listen to a briefing. The world would not grow simpler with time. We would suffer setbacks that made tonight's calm look like a luxury we had not deserved. But we had made something real from concrete, plate steel, rope, seed, radio wire, and a set of rules we could live with. We had chosen to be more than a place that holds out. We had chosen to be a place that holds. We called our compound the Bastion at Eagle Rock because the sign out front still said Eagle Rock Armory, and because a bastion is not just a wall, it is a shape that lets 2 sides protect a third. That word fit better each week. We kept our promise. When other people asked for advice, we gave it freely. When they asked for a map, we gave them our old plans so they would not have to invent their own mistakes. When a stranger at a battered gate squinted through smoke and asked whether we were the ones who would trade water for information and seed for work, we said yes. That was our way. Not a banner in the wind, not a broadcast at full volume, not a speech, a plan, a gate that opened with rules, a table with room for one more if they understood what it took to keep that table standing. As the first real cold rolled in and the trees along the river dropped leaves that stuck to our boots, we tightened the bolts one more time and we wrote the next week's tasks on the whiteboard. I looked at the list and felt the same thing I had felt the first night the television went dark and we closed the steel door. I felt work ahead and the good weight of a duty chosen. I felt the steadiness that comes from discipline that is not about orders but about care. I felt that we had built something that made sense, something that could outlast noise, and men who mistook noise for strength. At 0600 hours, 6 in the morning, the radio crackled. Lily's careful hand had written the time on the log as 0600 hours, because that is how we wrote it now. A voice I did not recognize spoke clearly. "Bastion at Eagle Rock, this is Lakeside. We have a small group traveling your direction with seeds and tools to trade. We are sending them with a written list and a wagon. They are decent. Please advise if they should approach at the south lane or the main gate." "Lakeside, this is Bastion," I said. "Have them approach the south lane on foot with the wagon. One person in front with empty hands. We will meet them at the gate." I paused, not because I was unsure, but because the next sentence felt like a small ceremony that deserved a bit of space. "Tell them to bring their list and their names," I said, "and tell them they are welcome, subject to our rules." I set the radio down and looked at the roof and the yard and the field and the greenhouse and the line of barrels that caught the last of the night's dew. I breathed in the steady air of a place that had learned how to be itself. Then I went downstairs to write 2 new tasks on the board: walk the fence after the storm, check for undercut near the ditch, Teach Lily how to check fuel filters on the generator. The chalk squeaked. People began to wake and to look for purpose. The bastion at Eagle Rock held. The gate would open when we were ready, not when someone else demanded it. The day would be ours to build. One piece of plate, one seed tray, one radio call, one act of quiet firmness at a time. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.